So the portraits we will be looking at to close this evening are 19th century card portraits. Now these aren't actually very difficult to come by. So while we are surrounded by gram portraits, such as this one by Thomas Gainsborough, I'll just distribute some examples, so please have a look. Now a card portrait, or a carte de visite, as they were called from their French origin, was a small photographic portrait mounted upon card. They were very common in the second half of the 19th century, constantly being passed from hand to hand as we are doing now. Today, this kind of portrait can be found in the National Gallery archive, preserved in plastic sleeves. But they can also be found on eBay, selling for 99 pence, which is where I got these ones from. Card portraits were both common and precious to the Victorians, as we will explore. The story I wish to tell this evening is one of loving and burning card portraits in 19th century literature, particularly in Thomas Hardy's novels and poems. Set against the backdrop of the relentless circulation of card portraits in the second half of the century, individual portrait items become the subject and object of intense feeling in his writing. The frame is a very useful one if you take out the likeness. These are the words of Thomas Hardy's fictional broker shop owner in his 1895 novel Jude the Obscure. In this unsettling episode, the long-suffering hero Jude enters a dingy broker's shop, and amid a heterogeneous collection of saucepans, a clothes horse, rolling pin, brass candlestick, swing-looking glass, and other things at the back of the shop, perceives a framed photograph which turned out to be his own portrait. Now imagine stumbling across your own portrait for sale in a shop. "Oh," said the broker, seeing him look at this and the other articles in the heap, and not perceiving that the portrait was of himself. "It is a small lot of stuff that was knocked down to me at a cottage sale. The frame is a very useful one, if you take out the likeness. You shall have it for a shilling." Framed in bird's eye maple, inscribed with the dedication "Jude to Arabella," the photograph had been a gift for Jude's wife on their wedding day. Despite this precious provenance, Jude now buys back his own portrait at the cost of the wooden frame. The photograph has become valueless compared to the frame, and seemingly no more important than a second-hand clothes horse. We might ask, how does the broker miss the fact that the original of the photograph is standing in front of him? Perhaps the likeness is a poor resemblance of Jude's. Perhaps the photographer was an amateur, as so many were at that time. Perhaps the broker, just urgent to make a sale, is simply blind to the similarity. Whatever the reason, it gives rise to a moment of tragic irony that is repeated in Hardy's 1928 poem called The Son's Portrait. A woman purchases from a lumber shop the fly-flecked portrait of her deceased son for the cost of the frame at 18 pence. It means a lot to her. It enables her to see her son again and to always see him despite his absence. But to the seller, I quote, "The picture is nothing. The photograph is worth nothing as it has no function, or the frame can be recycled to house a different face." We must therefore also ask, what does it mean when the frame is more valuable than the portrait? Are faces, in fact, exchangeable? Henry Mayhew, a Victorian investigative journalist, wrote in 1861, "The fact is that people don't know their own faces. Half of them have never looked in a glass half a dozen times in their life, and directly they see a pair of eyes and a nose, they fancy they are their own." Mayhew, in fact, recounts how photographic studios often duped their customers into purchasing another's portrait as their own. So the days when obtaining a portrait of yourself or a loved one was reserved for the rich elite were in the past. With the invention of photography mid-century, the medium in which faces could be recorded was revolutionized. The classes of society that could afford to be immortalized expanded, and the spaces in which portraits were seen proliferated. Having your portrait taken had become quick, easy, and cheap. Portraiture was now more than ever a booming business, and this brought with it its problems, which Jude is now faced with. Although not a bargain for Jude on a stonemason's salary, a shilling remains a reasonable price for a portrait. A shilling is also a small price to pay to remove oneself from the public marketplace. Can portraits be nameless? Are they under threat of being so if taken out of context? In Hardy's early novel, Desperate Remedies, the deceitful Aeneas Manston exploits the format of the card portrait when he interchanges two photographs and their mounts in order to exchange people's identities. He is relying on the fact that to some, the portrait means nothing without the name printed on the mount. For it to mean something, the owner must know the subject. Indeed, for Hardy's reader, as for the broker, Jude's photograph means nothing as an image. Hardy omits all description of the face the photograph visually depicts. The reader knows nothing of Jude's appearance in the image and is prevented from undertaking the typical Victorian practice of interpreting his character from his portrait. What the reader does know about the photograph is that it has changed hands several times. After being held in Jude's loving hands, it was discarded by Arabella, bought at auction for a discounted book price and displayed by a common broker in his shop window, only to return to its original owner. It is a journey of social and economic transaction that erodes the portrait photograph's value and function. Of course, Jude does recognize his face staring back at him in the broker shop, and it stares back at him mockingly. Jude's chance discovery, Hardy's narrator tells us, is the mute and undesigned evidence of the death of every tender sentiment in his wife. In Jude's eyes, the photograph is worth nothing, but signifies everything. In an act of self-deprecation, Jude paid the shilling, took the photograph away with him, and burnt it, frame and all. Jude reduces the photograph and frame to ashes in an act that emphasizes its effective materiality. From supposedly useful frames, we now turn to the second part of this talk's title, Dead Pasteboard. Throughout Hardy's novel, card portraits such as this one are frequently exchanged between the hands of lovers. Sue Bridehead, Jude's new love interest, gives to both Jude and his love rival Phillotson duplicates of the same photograph. Later in the novel, Phillotson unearths this photograph that attracts his attention, her dark eyes and hair making a very distinct and attractive picture of her, which just disclosed, too, the thoughtfulness that lay behind her lighter moods. It was a duplicate of the one she had given Jude and would have given to any man. Phillotson brought it halfway to his lips, but withdrew it in doubt at her perplexing phrases, ultimately kissing the dead pasteboard with all the passionateness and more than all the devotion of a young man of 18. The photograph means a great deal to the hands and eyes and lips of its owner, but its frame, the mere card that the portrait is mounted upon, again rivals the image for centre stage. Ironically, the dead pasteboard is the most emotionally charged aspect of the card portrait. Hardy describes the mount as dead pasteboard to question Phillotson's love. While he can physically possess Sue's portrait, he cannot truly obtain her love. The photograph becomes a surrogate through which he can perform the intimate act he desires. Both the useful frame and dead pasteboard tell of the loss or absence of love, which exchanging and possessing card portraits of loved ones would typically entail. As art historians have suggested, the frame surrounding an artwork not merely houses the image, but participates in its meaning. This is true of the cart mount, however unofficial a frame it offers, which for Hardy often becomes the most telling part of the portrait. Our attention on frames emphasizes that the card portrait's significance lies not only in its status as an image, but also in its condition as an object that is framed, inscribed, sold, kissed, and destroyed. As Hardy shows, the dialectic of economic, functional, and emotive value for the portrait photograph vitally hinges upon its sometimes conflicted nature as both image and object. In Hardy's poetry, the conflict becomes more profound due to the nature of the frame of the literary text. But first, let us look more at the card portrait as an object. The portrait photograph is a distinctly Victorian object whose social history was based upon its identity as one in a mass. Photography first emerged in 1839 with the invention of the daguerreotype. A single image was created from a negative formed after a long exposure time. It was seen as a magical process. But photographic science evolved very quickly. By the 1860s, the process had fully industrialized and multiple copies could be made from a single negative. The daguerreotype was swept away with the overwhelming popularity of the carte de visite. By the end of the century, when Hardy was writing Jude, the Kodak snapshot was prevalent. But to look at the portrait as a material object in the 19th century is to look at the photograph, and specifically at the carte. The discourse surrounding the carte's popularity as a pervasive, portable, and democratic mode of portraiture reflects its dominance in the mid to late Victorian literary imagination. Now, Hardy was very familiar with photography. In his letters, he complained about being unknowingly Kodaked by literary tourists with cameras peering over the hedges and looking under his home. He also had many photographs of himself taken throughout his life. He featured as part of his collection of celebrity portraits that could be found in an unusual place in the closing decades of the century, inside cigarette packets. He is seen with his recognizable moustache and identified as the man who wrote famous novels. While the choice of Hardy as subject marks his celebrity status, the card was less an advert for his novels as for Ogden's Guinea Gold cigarettes. The card's initial function was also distinctly a practical one, to stiffen the cigarette packaging and to protect this product inside. Ogden's use of the photographic process transformed the trading card into an item of portraiture. It also shows the radical transformation that portraiture underwent during the period. The heightened objectness of the cigarette card exposes the card portrait as another item of ephemera. It is telling that the format of the card was determined not by the size of the photographic likeness, but by the mount upon which it was pasted for support. The mounts were manufactured to a standard size, and it was the photograph that would be trimmed to fit the card rather than the other way around. Although the portrait's edges were often curved to recall the traditional manner of framing paintings, the card was meant to be held and gazed upon in the hand rather than admired from a distance. By removing the portrait from the wall and placing it in the hand, the card became an intensely intimate item. As noted by John Plunkett, the result could be troubling. He wrote, "By the very literal handiness of their use, cards imbued their subjects with the quotidian qualities of their format." Now, this was certainly the case for Jude, who was anonymized and auctioned for sale by the way of his portraits. Hardy, too, became a piece of portable property for sale in the form of the cigarette card. But it was also because of their handiness that cards were celebrated and loved in the 19th century as items of portable property. While the 18th century had already experienced the painted miniature, the photograph that was so much quicker to produce and reproduce soon became the quintessential portrait in miniature of the 19th century. Card portraits were distinguished by the banality of their materiality and by their sheer number. Private encounters could be had with famous celebrities, including Hardy, and the unknown individual was circulated amongst the public. Photographic card portraits were encountered in various spaces in the mid to late 19th century, in shop windows and in cigarette cases. They were also found in the novel. Many critics have become interested in the things that pervade Victorian novels, and the circulating card portrait should be counted amongst this stuff. Its ubiquity in fiction reflects its prevalence in society, but the card portrait should not merely be read as a historical detail in the descriptive fabric of the realist text. Hardy's treatment of photographs often pulls his fiction away from realism. In his 1894 short story titled An Imaginative Woman, this is especially evident. Ella Marchmill falls in love with the photograph of a poet despite never having met the man himself. Hardy gestures towards the supernatural when, after Ella hides the portrait from her husband beneath her pillow, she later gives birth to a son bearing the poet's resemblance. On the one hand, the card portrait was a common object. On the other, it remains distinguished because of the inescapable fact that it is both an object and an image. Julia Breitbach has written on the photograph as a thing of burning significance. Although she does not write specifically of 19th century card portraits, her use of this adjective to describe the intense meaning of photographs recalls the fate of Jude's portrait. She explains, "For the individual and a close circle of friends and family, photographs seldom represent objects of tepid concern, but very often things of burning significance. They mark the hot spots of a person's life as constructed retrospectively through personal narrative. By way of their sheer materiality on the one hand, and their seeming transparency of a bygone reality on the other, photos seem to lend a vicarious stability to fickle memories, providing structural support and narrative coherence to human biographies." Her language of materiality, describing the photograph as structural support, works with the idea of a photograph's temporal transparency. A photograph not only acts as a window onto the past, it also presents a past moment materially in the present. Hardy would have liked the idea that a photograph tells a personal narrative. When photographs are collected in an album, a complete narrative of the subject's life is formed. For Hardy, it is a narrative structured by feeling rather than time, and the story is one of the beholder of the photograph rather than its subject. Hardy takes advantage of the photograph's temporal contradiction in the fluid medium of verse. So from his novels, we now move to look at his poetry, in which Hardy presents an album of photographic images. In his poem At Castle Botterill, written in March 1913, shortly after his wife's death, the speaker looks behind him down the fading byway to figuratively look into the past and see on its slope, now glistening wet, distinctly yet, myself in a girlish form. Hardy stages an impossible meeting of the past and present versions of the scene, with the landscape glistening in the rain as a kind of mirror to the past. While time has banished from sight the substance of the loved one's presence, her image has lived on in his mind to be seen again now as a phantom figure where she once stood. The ghostliness of the poem may suggest that it has nothing to do with the material photograph. Emphasizing the materiality of the photograph may now seem futile, since as part of a text, this materiality is approached through the immateriality of words. Yet the notion of seeing the past in the present cannot fail to bring to mind a photograph, the 19th century phenomenon that materially arrests time. Hardy's memory traces are perceived as vividly as looking at a photograph. But the photographic image offers only momentary comfort from time's inevitable progression. It is always on the verge of fading. Any sense of comfort is offset with the anticipation of its loss, because for Hardy, the passing of time is only seen when it has already taken place. This is the nature of the photographic portrait. Since the photograph is an image created directly from the tangible presence of the sitter, that is from the non-absent, it is paradoxically the material evocation of absence. The outline of the woman on the highway is shrinking, as the sand of time falls. Hardy's poems are themselves suspended in a moment when the memory trace is visible. The poem preserves her outline that we will know disappear. For this reason, Dennis Tyler compares Hardy's poems less to photographs and more to photographic frames. Perhaps a photograph is only ever framing its own absence. If photographs tell stories, the story that the card portrait tells for Hardy is one of its own fragility. The card portrait is an evocative object that captures the observer's imagination to the point that it becomes haunting. What we are left with is the motif of dead pasteboard. This phrase is given another meaning in Hardy's poem The Photograph, with which I would like to bring this talk to a close. Jude's act of burning his portrait becomes the central action of the poem, in which the act of destroying the photograph of a past lover is feared to put its subject to death. The flame crept up the portrait line by line, as it lay on the coals in the silence of nights profound, and over the arm's incline, and along the marge of the silkworm superfine, and gnawed at the delicate bosom's defenceless round. Then I vented a cry of hurt, and averted my eyes. The spectacle was one that I could not bear, to my deep and sad surprise. But compelled to heed, I again looked furtive-wise till the flame had eaten her breasts and mouth and hair. "Thank God she's out of it now," I said at last, in a great relief of heart when the thing was done, that had set my soul aghast, and nothing was left of the picture unsheathed from the past, but the ashen ghost of the card it had figured on. She was a woman long hid amid packs of years. She might have been living or dead. She was lost to my sight, and the deed that had nigh drawn tears was done in the casual clearance of life's arrears. But I felt as if I had put her to death that night. Well, she knew nothing thereof did she survive, and suffered nothing if numbered among the dead. Yet, if on earth alive did she feel a smart, and with vague strange anguish strive? If in heaven did she smile at me sadly and shake her head? The poem fulfilled the haunting potential of Jude's self-deprecating act. After looking at card portraits and all their materiality, we close on the striking evocation of the ashen ghost of the card that is left once the image is gone from sight. The material and temporal contradiction of the card portrait inspired Hardy to use them as objects and subjects in his fraught narratives. Like his characters, Hardy was himself wary of having his photograph taken. He gave one photographer a strict condition. "You may take as many photographs as you like," he said, "if you will destroy the negatives of those I don't approve of." In an act with strong resonance to Jude's, the negatives and prints of a series of 12 portraits of Hardy were destroyed.